The Kethvarun hegemony had been watching humanity for 11 years before they made formal contact. That was the first thing Ambassador-designate Lieutenant Commander Yara Solis learned when she stepped off the transport shuttle onto the diplomatic platform orbiting Ketha Prime. 11 years of observation. 11 years of cataloging human behavior, military posture, territorial expansion, and biological variance. The hegemony's intelligence apparatus was thorough in a way that made most species nervous. Yara was not most species. She was 34 years old, a decorated signals intelligence officer from the UN Joint Command's 3rd Interstellar Liaison Corps, a division that until 8 months ago had only existed on paper. She held no formal diplomatic credentials. She had not attended the Zurich Diplomatic Academy. She did not speak any of the 3 primary Kethvarun dialects with fluency, relying instead on a translation matrix embedded in her suit's collar hardware. She was, by every measurable standard of interstellar protocol, the wrong person for this assignment. That was, of course, precisely the point. The mission directive had come down from UN Security Council joint session with 3 lines of operational text and a single classified appendix that Yara had read 4 times on the transit from Earth's L2 relay station. The Kethvarun had requested a human representative. The Council had responded by sending the most junior officer with a clean enough security clearance to be expendable and a psychological profile that described her, in bureaucratic language, as resistant to social pressure hierarchies. In plain language, she didn't intimidate easily and she didn't perform reverence on command. The Council's diplomatic corps, the actual ambassadors, the career envoys, the people who had trained for exactly this kind of moment, had been deliberately withheld. The message embedded in that choice was one the hegemony would understand immediately. We are not taking this seriously enough to send someone important. It was a calculated insult dressed in procedural language. Yara understood that. She had been briefed on it. She had signed a document acknowledging that her assignment was, in diplomatic terms, a slight, a signal that humanity did not view the Kethvarun's overture as worthy of its senior personnel. She had signed the document without comment. What the Council had not fully accounted for, what the appendix had only partially addressed, was what would happen if the hegemony didn't interpret the slight the way it was intended. The platform was enormous. Not in the theatrical way of science fiction, not curved and glowing and filled with alien grandeur for its own sake, but enormous the way industrial infrastructure is enormous, functional, dense, and built to last. Docking arms extended in geometric arrays. Atmospheric processing units hummed along the outer skin. The lighting was efficient rather than dramatic. It felt, to Yara's eye, like an orbital maintenance hub that had been repurposed for formal proceedings. That told her something. The Kethvarun had not built a grand hall to receive humanity. They had cleared space in something practical. Either they didn't consider this significant enough to warrant ceremony, or, and this was the reading Yara thought more likely, they had deliberately chosen a utilitarian setting to match what they expected humanity to send. They had expected someone low-ranking. They had been right. Yara stepped through the pressurized gate with her 2-person support staff, Petty Officer First Class Don Visser, her communications specialist, and Dr. Amara Okeke, a xenobiologist who had been assigned less for diplomatic utility and more because someone in the Council had wanted a scientist present in case the whole thing went sideways in an interesting direction. The welcoming delegation was 7 figures deep. Yara had been briefed on Kethvarun physiognomy, bilateral symmetry, elevated cranial structure, skin pigmentation that shifted slightly with internal temperature, eyes that processed in a slightly wider spectrum than human range. They were tall, roughly 2 meters on average, with a bearing that conveyed something between stillness and readiness. Not threatening. But not relaxed either. The figure at the front of the delegation was introduced, via translation, as Consul Arbiter Thesavine Kora, a title that Yara's briefing materials described as roughly equivalent to a senior judicial diplomatic officer. Someone who both negotiated and, when necessary, adjudicated. The Kethvarun apparently did not distinguish cleanly between diplomacy and law. Consul Kora looked at Yara for a long moment. The translation matrix in Yara's collar processed a short exchange between 2 members of the hegemony delegation. Quiet, not directed at the humans. Don's earpiece caught it. He relayed the transcription to Yara through a bone conduction feed. They sent a military signaler. Not even a civilian envoy. And then a pause. A response from Consul Kora herself, equally quiet. Good. Civilians perform. Soldiers observe. Yara did not react. She filed the exchange in the part of her mind she reserved for things that mattered more than they appeared to. Consul Kora stepped forward and performed a gesture with both hands. Palms oriented outward, fingers extended, held at shoulder height for 3 seconds. Yara's briefing had covered this. It was not a greeting in the conventional sense. It was closer to what a human might call an acknowledgement of witness. I see that you are here. I accept that you are here. It was, she realized, not the greeting you gave an insult. It was the greeting you gave someone you intended to watch carefully. Yara brought her own hands up, mirroring the posture with the form she had practiced 17 times in the transit corridor that morning. It wasn't perfect. Her angle was slightly wrong, and her fingers didn't hold quite the right tension. But it was close enough that Consul Cora's eyes shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, with something that the xenobiology briefings had classified as recalibration. The consul had expected to be met with ignorance. She was being met with effort. It was a small thing. In the context of interstellar diplomacy, it was almost nothing. But Yara had spent 12 years in signals intelligence, and she understood better than almost anyone alive that the most important transmissions were the ones that happened in the gaps between formal channels. She had just sent one. Behind her, she heard Don exhale, barely audible, more of a controlled breath than a sound. He had caught it too. Dr. Okeke, for her part, was already cataloging the atmospheric composition of the room with the sensor array built into her jacket sleeve, because Dr. Okeke was, above all things, a scientist, and scientists collected data first and had feelings about it later. Yara lowered her hands. Consul Cora lowered hers. The first moment of actual contact between humanity and the Kethvaran hegemony had lasted approximately 45 seconds and contained no words at all. That, too, told Yara something. The platform's processing units continued their steady hum. Somewhere in the docking array, a pressure seal adjusted with a mechanical sigh. The hegemony delegation waited. Yara took one step forward. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Yara Solis," she said, letting the translation matrix carry it. "I've been sent by the United Nations Joint Command. I don't have a title that maps cleanly onto your diplomatic structure, so I'll be direct. I'm an intelligence officer who was told to listen carefully and not break anything." Pause. "I intend to honor both instructions." Consul Cora held still for 2 full seconds. Then, for the first time, she spoke directly to Yara, not to her delegation, not in a formal register but in the quieter, syntactically compressed mode that the briefing materials had flagged as the Kethvaran equivalent of speaking plainly. The translation came through half a second later. "Then we will begin." The briefing room they were given was small by the platform's scale, a rectangular space with a single elongated table, atmospheric conditioning tuned slightly warmer than standard human comfort range, and walls that were bare except for what appeared to be acoustic dampening panels. No windows. No decorative elements. It was a room designed for information exchange, not impression management. Yara approved of it immediately. Consul Cora sat across the table with 2 members of her delegation, both introduced with titles that translated approximately as technical record keepers, which Yara interpreted as stenographers with classified access. Yara sat with Don to her left and Dr. Okeke to her right. A third translation layer was now running, the matrix in Yara's collar, a secondary system operated by Don, and a hegemony-provided interpreter who sat slightly behind the console and spoke only when the automated systems flagged ambiguity. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Exchange of formal identifications. Confirmation of translation accuracy. A brief technical calibration where both sides spoke a standardized set of phrases to verify that idiom and inference were being handled correctly rather than just vocabulary. Yara had been warned that this part would feel slow. It didn't feel slow to her. It felt like the kind of careful instrument check a pilot does before takeoff. Unglamorous, essential, and conducted by someone who understands that the moment you skip the checklist is the moment everything goes wrong at altitude. Then Consul Cora placed a data tablet on the table, oriented it toward Yara, and activated the display. Yara looked at it. She kept her face still. On the screen was a tactical visualization, rendered in hegemony display format, color-coded differently than human systems, but unmistakably a spatial engagement map. Vectors, positions, debris fields, energy discharge signatures. Yara had spent 7 years reading maps like this. She knew what she was looking at. It was the Battle of Meridian Cross. She knew it by the geometry. The engagement had taken place 4 years ago in the Meridian system, a confrontation with the Surathi collective that had lasted 11 days and resulted in the destruction of 6 UN combined fleet vessels, the disabling of a Surathi carrier group, and a tactical withdrawal that the Joint Command had publicly described as a strategic repositioning. Privately, within the classified reporting structure, It had been called something closer to a near-catastrophic loss that had been prevented from becoming a complete one by the decision of a single frigate captain to use her vessel as a blocking element while the remaining ships escaped the engagement envelope. Captain Rosa Abrance had been posthumously decorated. Her name appeared on a memorial wall at Fleet Command in Geneva. The full tactical record of what she had actually done, the exact nature of the blocking maneuver, the communication she had sent in her final 12 minutes, the improvised targeting solution that had disabled 2 Surathi vessels before the UNCS Ferreira was destroyed, was classified at the highest level the Joint Command maintained. The visualization on Console Chorus tablet contained that classified information. Not approximately. Not inferred from intercept. The exact vectors. The exact timing. The energy signature of the Ferreira's final engagement sequence. Yara looked at the tablet for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Console Cora. "You were at Meridian Cross," she said. The console's temperature-sensitive pigmentation shifted, marginally, along the jaw. The xenobiology briefings had flagged that particular shift as associated with what might be called being caught at something. "We were observing," the console said through translation. "We did not participate." "You had sufficient proximity to record that level of detail," Yara said. "Which means you were within engagement range. Which means you made a choice not to intervene." Pause. "We were not in a position to intervene," the console said. "And we did not know at that time whether intervention would have been welcomed." Yara considered that answer. It was not, she noted, a denial. It was a justification, and a carefully worded one that contained more information than it appeared to. The hegemony had been present. They had chosen observation over engagement. And they had kept that observation classified from humanity for 4 years. "Why show me this now?" Yara asked. Console Cora turned the tablet around, facing it back toward herself, and deactivated the display. "Because we want you to understand," she said, "that we have been watching for longer and more carefully than your council assumes. And because we want you to understand that what we observed at Meridian Cross was not what we expected to see." Yara waited. The console continued. "The Surathi Collective has engaged 17 species in territorial expansion over the last 40 years. In 13 of those cases, the engaged species withdrew within the first 3 encounters. In 3 cases they fought for longer but ultimately negotiated territory loss. In 1 case they were effectively neutralized as a spacefaring civilization within a decade." She paused. "You are the first species the Surathi have engaged that did not withdraw, did not negotiate a loss, and has not been neutralized. At Meridian Cross you lost 6 vessels. You destroyed or disabled 11 Surathi ships. And your withdrawal was tactical, not permanent." Another pause, this one longer. "The Surathi filed a formal grievance with the hegemony's Interstellar Arbitration Council 6 months after Meridian Cross. They requested that we classify humanity as an unpredictable threat and impose movement restrictions on your fleet expansion." Yara felt Dawn go very still beside her. "We declined," the console said. "That decision was not without internal dispute. There are members of the hegemony's council who believe the Surathi assessment is correct, that humanity is an unpredictable variable in a region of space that has been, for a long time, stable in its instabilities." She looked at Yara directly. "I'm not among them. But I am in the minority." Yara absorbed this. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the soft ambient cycling of the atmospheric system. Dr. Okeke, to her right, had stopped operating her sleeve sensor. Don had his hands flat on the table. "You reached out to us," Yara said. "The formal contact request came from the hegemony." "Yes." "Why now? What changed?" Console Cora's pigmentation shifted again, this time along the upper forehead, which the briefings had associated with a different category of response. "Not being caught at something. Something closer to decision. The Surathi have begun building again," she said. "A different kind of fleet. Not territorial expansion vessels. The configuration is something the Arbitration Council has not seen in over 200 years. Yara kept her voice level. "What was it 200 years ago?" The console looked at her for a long moment before answering. "It was a punitive fleet," she said. "Built specifically to destroy a civilization that had embarrassed them." The translation matrix rendered the word embarrassed, but flagged it with a linguistic annotation. The Kethveran term used carries connotations closer to made to demonstrate weakness in front of witnesses. Meridian Cross had been witnessed. The hegemony had been present. Humanity had made the Surathi demonstrate weakness in front of observers from a major interstellar power. And now the Surathi were building a punitive fleet. Yara looked at the blank wall to her left for approximately 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Consul Cora. I'm going to need to file a contact report to Joint Command, she said. Priority classification. I'll need uninterrupted transmission access. We anticipated that, the consul said. The channel has been prepared. Yara nodded once. After I file the report, she said, I'd like to continue this conversation. Specifically, I want to know what the hegemony is prepared to offer, what you want in return, and how much time we actually have. The consul studied her. You are not what we expected, she said, and this time the phrasing was in that quieter register again, the plain-speaking mode. No, Yara agreed. I don't think I am. She stood, and her chair made a soft sound against the floor. That's probably why they sent me. The transmission took 40 minutes to reach Earth via the hegemony's relay array, faster than anything humanity's own deep space communication infrastructure could manage at that distance, which was itself a piece of information Yara filed carefully. She spent those 40 minutes writing the report. Not dictating it. Writing it, in the old-fashioned sense, composing each sentence with the deliberateness she reserved for documents that she knew would be read by people looking for reasons to dismiss what they were reading. She had filed enough intelligence reports in her career to understand the failure modes. The three most common were: the report is too alarming and triggers denial, the report is too hedged and fails to convey urgency, or the report contains information that implicates previous decisions and therefore meets institutional resistance before it meets institutional attention. Her current report contained elements of all three failure modes. She wrote it anyway because the alternative was not writing it, and that was not something she was capable of. The response came back in 3 hours. It was routed through Captain Nils Berger, her nominal chain of command, a Joint Command desk officer who had been assigned as her point of contact specifically because he was senior enough to relay information upward and junior enough to be denied upward visibility when that was convenient for the people above him. The response was 6 lines. Lines 1 and 2 acknowledged receipt of her report. Line 3 noted that the intelligence regarding hegemony surveillance of the Meridian Cross engagement was being forwarded to the Director of Naval Intelligence for review. Line 4 stated that the characterization of Surathi fleet construction as punitive configuration required corroboration from independent human intelligence sources before Joint Command could assess it as operationally significant. Line 5 instructed her to continue diplomatic engagement and report further developments. Line 6 reminded her that she did not have authority to make any commitments on behalf of the United Nations or the Joint Command. She read Line 4 twice. Corroboration from independent human intelligence sources. The only independent human intelligence source with any direct access to Surathi fleet movements was the Signals Intelligence Network that Yara herself had spent 3 years building before being reassigned. That network had a latency of between 4 and 7 weeks on deep system observations. The hegemony was offering her real-time data on a punitive fleet construction they had been monitoring for months. The Council wanted her to cross-reference that data against a system that would take 6 weeks to respond. She set the reply message aside and went back to the briefing room. Consul Cora was waiting. Not impatiently. The Kethvarin did not appear to experience impatience in the way humans did, or at least did not express it through the physical restlessness that Yara associated with the emotion. She was simply present, seated, with a posture that conveyed complete readiness and zero urgency at the same time. Your command has concerns, the consul said. Was not a question. My command has a process, Yara said. The process has a timeline. The timeline and the situation we're discussing are not well matched. She sat down and placed her own tablet on the table. Tell me about the fleet. Everything you're willing to share. The consul nodded to one of her record keepers. A new display appeared on the room's central projection surface. A volumetric render, 3-dimensional, showing a construction site in what Yara's orientation data placed somewhere deep in the Surathi's inner systems. 4 stellar distances from the nearest human territorial marker. 2 from the edge of hegemony arbitration space. The construction was substantial. Yara had seen fleet construction renders before. She had classified them by tonnage, by drive signature, by armament profile. What she was looking at did not fit neatly into the categories she knew. The configuration is distinct from their territorial expansion class, she said. Those have a broader logistical train, fuel processing, medical infrastructure, colony support elements. This doesn't have that. No, the consul confirmed. There is no colony infrastructure. There is no extended range fuel processing beyond what is needed for a direct transit and return. Direct transit to where? Our models suggest the fleet is being constructed for a transit range consistent with reaching human-controlled space. Specifically the inner systems, not your frontier. Yara looked at the render. The inner systems. Not the border territories where humanity's expansion had been pushing outward, not the disputed zones where Surathi and human territorial claims had been generating friction for a decade. The inner systems, the established colonies, the industrial worlds, the inhabited planets with populations in the millions. What's the scale? She asked. The console spoke. The translation came back with a number that Yara made herself process twice before responding. That's larger than anything the Surathi have deployed in a single action, she said. Yes. Is this? She stopped, recalibrated her phrasing. What's the hegemony's confidence level in this data? The construction data is direct observation from our monitoring systems. Our confidence is high. Our uncertainty is in the timeline for completion and deployment. The console paused. We believe they are between 8 and 14 months from operational readiness. 8 months. The Joint Command Standard Response timeline for a full fleet mobilization review, from intelligence assessment through Council authorization to operational orders, was between 9 and 15 months under peacetime protocols. Under elevated alert status, it could be compressed. But elevated alert status required a finding of credible threat, and credible threat required corroboration from sources the Council trusted. 8 months. 14 at the outside. The hegemony wants something from this conversation, Yara said. You've been clear about what we're facing. You haven't been clear about what you want in return for sharing it. Consul Cora was quiet for a moment. We want a commitment, she said, that if the Surathi fleet acts against humanity and humanity responds, the response does not extend into hegemony arbitration space. Yara looked at her. You're asking us to fight with one boundary already established. We're asking you to not make the conflict larger than it already will be. It was, Yara reflected, a reasonable ask from the perspective of a civilization that had maintained stability in this region for 2 centuries. It was also an ask that carried an implication. The hegemony believed the conflict was coming regardless. They were not trying to prevent it. They were trying to contain it. I can't make that commitment, Yara said. You know that. I don't have the authority. We know, the consul said. But we believe you can make a different commitment. What commitment? That you will make sure the right people hear this conversation. Not filtered through a process. Not delayed for corroboration. She looked at Yara steadily. We reached out to your government. Your government sent you. That was either an insult or a message. If it was an insult, we have wasted time we do not have. If it was a message. It was a message, Yara said. Then we are speaking to the right person. And the right person has a responsibility. Yara sat with that for a moment. In the Joint Command's organizational structure, she was a lieutenant commander. She was below the rank threshold for independent operational decisions. She had no treaty-making authority, no formal diplomatic standing, no mechanism to commit resources or policy. What she had was a clearance level high enough to access the direct communication channel to the Director of Naval Intelligence. Not through Captain Berger, not through the standard relay chain, but directly. It was a channel she had been given for emergency intelligence transmission and had used exactly once before, 3 years ago, when she had intercepted data indicating a Surathi reconnaissance probe had entered the Sol system's outer boundary. That message had resulted in a quiet 6-month investigation that had confirmed the probe's presence and then been officially denied in all public channels. The channel existed. She had the access. Using it would bypass her chain of command. It would be professionally consequential in ways that were difficult to predict. It would also mean that the information reached someone with actual authority in hours rather than weeks. I'll make the call, she said. But I need more. Not just fleet construction data. I need the hegemony's full intelligence record on Surathi disposition and intent. Everything you have. Consul Cora looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly she reached forward and added 3 more data packages to the display. We prepared these before you arrived, she said. We were waiting to see if you were worth giving them to. The call went out at 0340 platform time, which translated to 1,420 hours in Geneva, where Vice Admiral Constance Mwangi, Director of Naval Intelligence, UN Joint Command, was in the middle of a budget allocation review that she had been trying to conclude for 3 days. The emergency channel alert interrupted it. Mwangi had received 17 emergency channel activations in her 11 years in the director's role. 4 had been genuine emergencies. The other 13 had been, in her assessment, urgent situations that had been inflated to emergency status by officers who lacked the confidence to wait for normal channels to function. She had a mental taxonomy for them. She looked at the source identifier on the activation. Lieutenant Commander Yara Solis. Ketha Prime Diplomatic Platform. 6 hours into what was supposed to be a routine first contact observation assignment. Mwangi set down her budget documents and accepted the channel. The transmission quality was excellent, better than she was used to from that distance, which told her the relay was running through hegemony infrastructure rather than UN systems. Another data point. She filed it. Solis's face appeared on screen. She looked composed in the way that people look composed when they have spent conscious effort becoming composed. Not natural calm but constructed calm. Mwangi recognized it. She had worn that expression herself. Director, Solis said. Commander, Mwangi replied. I'm going to start a recording. You understand this conversation becomes part of the official record. Understood. That's why I'm making it. Mwangi noted that too. The officer wasn't trying to move outside the record. She was using the emergency channel specifically because it was recorded at the highest classification level, because she wanted documentation that this information had been transmitted and received with timestamps. She was protecting herself from the possibility that the information would be ignored and the consequences would later be attributed to a failure of intelligence transmission. Go ahead, Mwangi said. Solis went ahead. She spoke for 14 minutes. She was precise, structured, and did not editorialize except in 2 places. Once when she flagged her own uncertainty about the translation accuracy of a specific Kethvaran technical term, and once at the end, when she said flatly that she believed the intelligence was credible and that the timeline did not accommodate the standard review process. Mwangi listened without interrupting. When Solis finished, there was a 3-second pause that the transmission delay could not fully account for. Then Mwangi asked her one question. The consul gave you the data packages before your emergency transmission. She said they had been prepared before you arrived. That means the hegemony expected you to go around your chain of command. It wasn't a question yet. Solis waited. How did they know you would? Mwangi asked. A pause on Solis's end. A real one. I don't know, Solis said. But I think, she stopped. Started again. I think they've been studying us long enough to know how our institutions respond to uncomfortable information. And I think they chose their initial contact approach specifically to create a situation where the most direct path would require someone to bypass the process. Another pause. They didn't want to talk to a committee, Solis said. They wanted to talk to someone who would actually do something with what they heard. Mwangi looked at the data packages that Solis had transmitted alongside the call. They were sitting in her classified intake queue, awaiting her authorization to open. She had not opened them yet. The fleet data, she said. Walk me through your confidence in the source. The hegemony's observation systems are more sophisticated than ours at that range. They had real-time construction monitoring. The data isn't inference, it's direct measurement. Solis paused. And they were at Meridian Cross, Director. They had tactical data on the Ferreira's final engagement that matched our classified record exactly. They're not fabricating capability to seem credible. They have the capability. Mwangi absorbed this. The Ferreira data. That was the element that had flagged in the initial report, and it was the element she kept returning to. The tactical record of Captain Abrantes' final 12 minutes was classified at the highest level maintained by the Joint Command. It was not accessible through any open source or publicly available channel. It had not been shared with any allied force. The only way the hegemony had it was if they had been present, which meant everything else Solis was telling her about hegemony observation capacity was almost certainly true. I'm going to open the data packages, Mwangi said. I'm going to have my analysts run preliminary assessment. That takes 48 hours minimum. The consul indicated 8 months to operational readiness at the minimum estimate, Solis said. 48 hours won't break that window, Mwangi said. What it will do is give me something concrete when I walk into the Security Council joint session and tell them we have a credible intelligence assessment indicating a Surathi punitive fleet is under construction with humanity as its target. Solis was quiet. You're going to the council, she said. I'm going to do my job, Mwangi said. Which is different from going to the council. Going to the council means I've already cleared it through the chain. Doing my job means I'm calling Admiral Park in the next 20 minutes, which means it goes to the Joint Chiefs within the hour, which means by the time the 48-hour analysis is done, the council will be briefed and waiting for it rather than receiving it cold. Solis exhaled, controlled, barely audible. There's one more thing, she said. The hegemony wants a commitment that any human military response stays outside their arbitration space. I told them I couldn't make that commitment. But I told them I could make sure the right people heard the conversation. That's the correct answer, Mwangi said. The boundary question is a council decision. But I'll note that the hegemony's ask is reasonable and that a reasonable ask from the party warning us about a punitive fleet should probably be answered with something better than silence. I'll relay that, Solis said. How are you doing, Commander? Mwangi asked. The question was not in the standard format for an emergency channel transmission. Solis seemed to register that. I'm functional, she said. The consul, she paused. She said something when I arrived. Before the formal conversation. She said that civilians perform and soldiers observe. Mwangi said nothing, waiting. I think she respected the assignment choice more than the council intended, Solis said. I think she wanted someone who would process what she was saying rather than someone who would manage it. What does she want from you specifically? Mwangi asked. Not from the council. From you. Solis thought about that. I think, she said slowly, she wants a human being she can trust to tell her the truth about what we're going to do. Not a promise. Not a commitment. Just honesty about our capacity and our intention. Can you give her that? I can try. Mwangi nodded once, more to herself than to the screen. Continue engagement. Don't make commitments. Don't downplay the urgency. And Solis. Director. Good call. She closed the channel and reached for her secondary comm. It took her 11 seconds to get Admiral Park on the line. The Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United Nations Combined Military Command met in emergency session 31 hours after Mwangi's call to Admiral Park. The session was held in the secure conference facility beneath the Geneva headquarters complex, a room that had been used for the most sensitive command decisions in the 40-year history of the Combined Command, including the authorization that had sent the Ferreira and 5 other ships to Meridian Cross. There were 7 voting members. The session lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. The final vote was 5-2. The 2 dissenting votes were cast by Admiral Park and Vice Admiral Mwangi. Yara received the summary of the decision through official channels this time, through Captain Berger, via standard relay, with the classification markings that indicated it had passed through the full council review process. She read it in the small rest cabin that had been assigned to her support team, with Don and Dr. Okeke present. She read it twice. The decision had 3 elements. The first element was an authorization for accelerated fleet mobilization in the inner systems. Not full war footing, but an elevated defensive posture that would bring significant combined fleet assets into positions that could respond to a Surathi approach within the projected timeline. This was the element that the Joint Chiefs had agreed on unanimously. The second element was an instruction to Yara to convey to Consul Cora that the United Nations would take the hegemony's arbitration space boundary request under advisement, and that formal response would be provided through official diplomatic channels within 60 days. Under advisement. 60 days. The third element, the one that had generated the dissenting votes, was a directive that the accelerated mobilization was to be framed, in all public and semi-public communication, as a scheduled readiness exercise. Not a response to intelligence. Not a war preparation. An exercise. The reasoning, as Berger had explained it in his accompanying note, was that the Council did not want to signal to the Surathi that humanity was aware of the fleet construction. The intelligence advantage of knowing what the Surathi were building was considered more valuable if the Surathi didn't know that humanity knew. Yara understood the logic. It was sound as far as it went. What it didn't account for was what she was now required to tell Consul Cora. Because the hegemony already knew about the Surathi fleet construction. The hegemony had shared that intelligence. And now humanity's formal response to the hegemony was going to be 60 days of diplomatic silence on the boundary question, and a military mobilization dressed as a training exercise. From where Consul Cora was sitting, that response would look like humanity had heard the warning, chosen not to formally acknowledge it, and quietly begun preparing for a war it wasn't willing to publicly recognize. Which was, Yara had to admit, more or less exactly what was happening. The question was how Cora would interpret that behavior. She requested the meeting through the platform's formal scheduling system. 20 minutes, standard briefing format. When she arrived, Consul Cora was already seated, and she had sent her record keepers out of the room. It was just the 2 of them and the translation apparatus. That was notable. The consul had not requested privacy in any of their previous sessions. Yara sat down. My command has responded to the intelligence you provided, she said. I know, the consul said. Yara paused. You've been monitoring our transmissions. We have been monitoring traffic patterns and relay usage, the consul said. Not content. But the volume and routing of your communications over the last 30 hours is consistent with an escalated review process reaching senior command. Pause. Also, I have some familiarity with how human institutions move when they have received alarming information and are choosing to act on it without appearing to act on it. Yara looked at her. That's a precise read. I have been studying your species for 11 years, the consul said, without any particular emphasis. Then you already know what the decision is likely to be. I know what the structure of the decision is likely to be, the consul said. I want to know what you think of it. That was a different question. A more direct one than any Cora had asked before. Yara considered her answer. She thought about the line she had been trained to hold between personal assessment and official position. She thought about what Mwangi had asked her, what does she want from you specifically, and the answer she had given. I think it's a defensible decision, she said. The mobilization is real. The Surathi won't be able to approach the inner systems without meeting a prepared force. That matters. And the rest? The consul asked. The rest is institutional caution. The council doesn't want to publicly acknowledge that they've received intelligence from a species they've never formally engaged before. That would require them to account for why they sent someone like me rather than a senior diplomat, and the answer to that question isn't comfortable. Consul Cora was quiet. So they're protecting themselves, she said. They're managing the narrative, Yara said. Which is a kind of protection. It's not dishonest exactly, the mobilization is real. It's just. She stopped. It's just that they received your warning and they're going to respond to it without formally acknowledging that they received it, she said. And that means your arbitration space boundary request is going to sit in a queue for 60 days while the fleet moves into position. The consul's pigmentation shifted, a pattern Yara had not seen before, distributed more evenly, which the briefings had not clearly characterized. I want to tell you something, Cora said, and her register had shifted, still the plain-speaking mode but slower, more deliberate. When the Hegemony's Council debated whether to reach out to humanity, the central argument against it was that your species responds to threat data by managing it rather than addressing it. That you would receive the information, perform the minimum required response, and then turn back to your internal processes. She looked at Yara. I argued against that characterization. I argued that the data we had on humanity, including Meridian Cross, suggested a species that, under genuine pressure, responds with something more direct. That the institutional caution is a surface behavior, not a fundamental one. What convinced you of that? Yara asked. The Ferreira, the consul said simply. Captain Abrance had the option to withdraw with the rest of the fleet. The tactical situation allowed for it. She would have survived. The mission outcome would have been marginally worse but within acceptable parameters. Pause. She chose to stay. Not because her orders required it. Her final transmission makes clear that it was a personal decision. She judged that the cost of staying was worth the outcome for her crew. The room was quiet. Institutional humanity behaved exactly as my colleagues predicted, the consul said. Your command received a warning and responded with calibrated action and managed disclosure. That is institutional behavior. She paused. But you called your director directly. You used a channel designed for genuine emergency. You made a judgment that the information was worth the professional consequences. That's a small thing, Yara said. Captain Abrance's decision was also, in tactical terms, a small thing, the consul said. It affected the outcome of one engagement. She reached forward and placed both hands flat on the table, not the formal acknowledgement gesture but something else. Simpler. More direct. I am not disappointed in your council's decision, she said. I expected it. What I did not expect, she paused, was you. The version of humanity that sends an intelligence officer on a first contact mission because it considers the mission expendable. And then the intelligence officer turns out to be someone who calls her director and tells her the truth. Yara looked at the consul's hands on the table. What do you need from me? She asked. I need you to stay, the consul said. Not as a placeholder for a senior diplomat. As yourself. As a person who will tell me honestly when your government is managing something versus addressing it, and who will tell your government honestly what the hegemony actually needs versus what we're formally requesting. Pause. I need a channel between two institutions that are individually capable of profound caution, that connects them through someone who is capable of something more direct. Yara was quiet for a moment. I can do that, she said. But I need something in return. The consul waited. If your monitoring systems observe any change in the Surathi fleet's timeline, any compression of the construction schedule, I need to know immediately. Not through formal channels. Directly. Cora looked at her. Then she said, agreed. The direct channel alert came through at 0217 platform time, 3 months and 11 days after the handshake agreement in the briefing room. Yara was awake when it arrived. She had not been sleeping well for 6 weeks. Not anxiety exactly, but the low-grade alertness of someone whose threat assessment had been elevated for long enough that her body had recalibrated its baseline. She had been reading a geological survey from the Meridian system that had nothing to do with anything, because sometimes the mind needs to be occupied with something genuinely inconsequential to rest without sleeping. She read the channel activation and was moving before she had consciously decided to move. The message from Console Cora was brief, direct. In the plain register that Yara had come to recognize as Cora's mode for information she considered too important to process through ceremony. The construction site at Surathi Inner Array 7 has gone dark. Array 7 is where the largest of the vessel-class units were being assembled. Dark means one of two things: the project has been suspended or the assembled vessels have departed. Based on the energy signatures we recorded in the 6 hours before the blackout, it is the second. We calculate departure of between 60 and 70% of the fleet we identified in the original intelligence. Destination vector is consistent with human inner system approach. Time to intercept range, estimated 72 to 90 hours from departure. Yara read it once. Read it again. 72 hours. 3 days. The original estimate had been 8 months minimum. They were 7 months into that window. She did the arithmetic. The Surathi had compressed their construction schedule by at least 30 days, possibly more. Either the original construction estimate had been conservative, or something had caused acceleration, a change in strategic calculus and intelligence failure on their end, or a deliberate decision to move before humanity's mobilization was fully positioned. The defensive mobilization that the Joint Chiefs had authorized 3 months ago had been progressing on a 12-month positioning timeline. It was approximately 40% complete. 40% complete against a fleet arriving in 72 hours. She opened a channel to Don first. He answered in 4 seconds, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. She transmitted the console's message without comment. There was a pause. "The mobilized assets," Don said. "What's positioned?" "I need to pull the operational status," Yara said. "Get Dr. Okeke. We're going to be awake for a while." She pulled the operational status while Don went to find Okeke. The numbers were not good. Not catastrophic. Not the scenario where humanity had no warning and no position forces at all, but not good. 40% of the planned defensive assets were in place. That translated, in the inner systems, to 3 carrier groups, 11 destroyer screen elements, and the fixed installation defense networks around Earth, Mars, and the 4 major orbital industrial platforms. The mobile strike elements that were supposed to provide offensive deterrence against an approaching fleet were still transiting toward their deployment positions. They would not be in place in 72 hours. What was in place could fight a defensive action. It could not fight a deterrent action, the kind of engagement that might make the Surathi choose to stop short rather than absorb the cost of continuing. Yara knew the difference. She had spent 3 years studying Surathi tactical doctrine. The Surathi, in every major engagement on record, had shown a consistent behavioral pattern. They pushed against resistance until the cost of pushing exceeded the value of what they were pushing toward, then withdrew and recalibrated. At Meridian Cross, the cost had exceeded the value at the point where Captain Abrance's blocking action destroyed 2 of their carrier vessels. They had withdrawn. They had filed a grievance. They had built a punitive fleet. The lesson they had taken from Meridian Cross was not that humanity was too strong to fight. The lesson was that humanity needed to be hit hard enough, quickly enough, that resistance became impossible before it could become effective. A punitive fleet was not designed for prolonged engagement. It was designed for overwhelming initial action. 40% of the planned defense, against an overwhelming initial action, was not the same as the full defense the Joint Chiefs had authorized. Yara filed the status report and opened her primary channel to Mwangi. The director answered in under 2 minutes. She was not in uniform, which meant she had been sleeping, and the expression on her face when she saw Yara's expression made her fully alert within approximately 3 seconds. Yara delivered the intelligence. Mwangi did not speak for 7 seconds. Then, "What are the hegemony's monitoring assets showing?" "I'm in contact with Console Cora. She can provide real-time vector data on the fleet's approach. We'd have better tracking than anything our own deep space sensors can give us on short notice." "She's offering that?" "She activated the direct channel," Yara said. "She didn't do it to give us news and leave us without support." Mwangi absorbed this. "I need to reach Admiral Park," she said. "I need the Security Council convened. This is a different situation than 3 months ago." "How long?" Council can be on screen in 40 minutes in emergency session. Decision authority for defensive engagement is already vested in the Joint Chiefs. That doesn't need a council vote. But expanding our positioning within 72 hours requires resource authorization that does need council approval. She paused. 40 minutes to session. 90 minutes to decision if everything goes right. And if it doesn't? Mwangi looked at her directly. Then we fight with what we have, she said. Which is what every military in history has done when the timeline moved on them. Director, Yara said. There's one more variable. Tell me. The hegemony's arbitration space boundary. If the Surathi fleet enters the inner systems and we respond, the engagement is going to extend outward as we push them back. We don't have a formal response to Korra's boundary request. If we push back aggressively and we're not bounded, we may push into space the hegemony has jurisdiction over. Mwangi was quiet. If we're in a shooting war in 3 days, she said, the council is going to have to decide whether the boundary commitment is something they're willing to make under pressure. Korra is willing to provide real-time fleet tracking to help us respond, Yara said. That's significant. That's not neutral third-party behavior. She's choosing a side. Or choosing an outcome, Mwangi said. She wants the Surathi punitive fleet stopped. That's not the same as choosing humanity. No, Yara agreed. But it might be close enough to work with. Mwangi nodded. Get Korra on a channel. Not the direct line, full official record. I want everything that happens in the next 72 hours documented at the highest classification level and time-stamped. Whatever decisions get made, I want them made on the record. Understood. And Solis, Mwangi paused. The hegemony's boundary request. When you talk to Korra, what's your read on whether she needs a formal response before she'll continue providing tracking support? Yara thought about this. I don't think she needs a formal response, she said. I think she needs to believe that the question is being taken seriously. That it's not another item in a queue. Can you give her that? Not as a commitment, Yara said. But as a truth, yes. Because I'm going to tell her that the Director of Naval Intelligence raised the boundary question in a session with the Joint Chiefs within 2 hours of receiving the original intelligence. Which is true. And that in the current session, it will be raised again as an urgent matter. Which it will be. Mwangi looked at her for a moment. That's honest, she said. I've found, Yara said, that it's the most useful thing I can be. The Surathi fleet entered the outer detection range of humanity's inner system sensors at 0614 hours on a Tuesday morning, a fact that would later seem almost absurdly mundane against the scale of what was happening, but which grounded every account of the engagement in a way that more dramatic timestamps never quite managed. Tuesday morning. Coffee was being made in offices across Geneva. Children were being walked to schools on Mars Colony 7. An orbital maintenance crew on the L3 industrial platform was 40 minutes into a scheduled hull inspection that their supervisor had been trying to schedule for 3 weeks. The fleet was 61 vessels. Smaller than the maximum estimate, not all of the construction had completed or not all of it had deployed, but larger than anything that had entered human-controlled space in any previous engagement. The configuration matched what the hegemony's intelligence had described. Drive signatures indicating maximum range transit capability, weapons arrays in the forward-mounted configuration associated with high-intensity initial engagement, logistics train compressed to the minimum required for a hard strike and withdrawal. The Joint Chiefs emergency session had produced a decision in 87 minutes. The Council had authorized 2 additional carrier groups from their transit positions. They would not arrive in time for the initial engagement, but their presence on approach vectors would be visible to the Surathi tactical systems within hours, which mattered. It also authorized a formal response to the hegemony's boundary request, a commitment in writing at the Council level that UN combined fleet assets would not enter hegemony arbitration space in prosecution of offensive operations arising from this engagement. Yara had relayed that commitment to Consul Korra 14 hours before the Surathi fleet arrived. Korra's response had been to provide uninterrupted real-time tracking data from the moment the fleet departed Surathi space. Every vector adjustment. Every formation change. Every communication intercept that the hegemony's monitoring systems captured. It arrived in Yara's channel and was immediately relayed to Fleet Command, where Admiral Park's operational staff integrated it into their defensive positioning in real time. It was not a gesture. It was a material contribution to the defense of humanity's inner systems. Yara spent the hours before the engagement sitting at the communications console in the platform's relay room, processing the data stream and routing it. It was signals intelligence work, The same work she had been doing for 12 years at a desk rather than a command station with technology rather than weapons. It was not dramatic. It was exactly right. The initial engagement lasted 6 hours. The Surathi fleet approached in a compressed wedge formation, the forward assault configuration that the tactical briefings had predicted. They hit the outer defense perimeter with a coordinated pulse strike that disabled one of the destroyer screen elements and damaged 2 more. The 3 carrier groups at the inner perimeter absorbed the following engagement and held at significant cost. 2 of the 3 carrier groups took damage that would require months of repair. 1 destroyer was destroyed. 14 crew were killed in the first hour. The Surathi lost 4 vessels in the first exchange. 2 to the destroyer screen before it was pushed back. 2 to the carrier group strike wing, which had been positioned based on the hegemony's real-time vector data, positioned precisely, not approximately, because the tracking information was accurate to a degree that human sensor systems could not have achieved at that range. The engagement settled into a holding pattern around the 3rd hour. The Surathi had not achieved their initial breakthrough. The human defense line was damaged but intact. The Surathi fleet was larger and had the offensive initiative, but every hour they spent without breakthrough was an hour the 2 additional carrier groups were getting closer. At hour 4, Admiral Park made a decision. He transmitted a direct communication to the Surathi fleet, unencrypted, on a frequency they could not ignore. The transmission did not contain threats. It did not contain demands. It contained a single piece of information, the vectors of the 2 approaching carrier groups, with their estimated arrival times. Not classified. Not tactical. Just the fact of them, stated plainly so that the Surathi fleet's command could run the arithmetic without having to calculate whether humanity was bluffing. They were not bluffing. The carrier groups were real and the vectors were accurate. The transmission also contained, and this was Park's judgment call, the thing he had not been certain about until the moment he sent it, the hegemony's tracking data attribution. A notation that the defensive positioning in the first 4 hours had been based on intelligence provided by the Kethvaran hegemony in accordance with their arbitration monitoring responsibilities. He was telling the Surathi that the hegemony had been watching, and that the hegemony had chosen to share what they saw with humanity. The Surathi fleet held its position for 47 minutes. Then it began to withdraw. Yara heard the withdrawal call through the relay feed. She stayed at her console until the fleet's vectors confirmed the withdrawal was genuine and not a feint, a judgment call that took another 2 hours, because genuine caution is indistinguishable from tactical anxiety from the outside, and she had been in intelligence long enough to know the difference only becomes clear over time. When the confirmation came through, she sat quietly for a moment with her hands on the console. Then she opened the channel to console Cora. The console was awake. Of course she was awake. She had been awake for the entire engagement, monitoring her own systems and managing the internal hegemony politics of a decision that a significant faction of the council had opposed. Yara had thought about that during the engagement, what it had cost Cora to provide the tracking data, what arguments she had been having with her own institution while Yara was having different arguments with hers. The fleet is withdrawing, Yara said. I know, Cora said. I have been watching. Admiral Park's transmission mentioned the hegemony tracking attribution. Pause. I saw it, Cora said. It was not something I anticipated. Is it a problem for you? Yara asked. With the council? The council was quiet for a moment. It will require a conversation, she said. The faction that opposed involvement will point to it as evidence that we have been drawn into a human Surathi conflict. Pause. They will not be entirely wrong. We have been drawn in, though I would describe it differently. I would describe it as choosing which outcome to contribute to. What outcome did you want? Yara asked. I wanted the Surathi fleet stopped without a catastrophic engagement that would make further conflict inevitable, the consul said. A hard defense that held, followed by a withdrawal, that creates a different political situation than a breakthrough followed by a drawn-out war. Another pause. The Surathi will bring this to the arbitration council. They will argue that the hegemony violated neutrality. Will they win that argument? No, Cora said. Monitoring and sharing observational data is within our mandate. We did not participate in the engagement. We observed and we reported. A beat. To whom we reported is a more complex question. Yara nodded slowly. What happens now, she asked. Between us. Between humanity and the hegemony. That depends on decisions that neither of us has authority to make, the consul said. Your council will want formal engagement now, the proper diplomatic structure, the senior envoys, the process. Pause. They will probably want you replaced by someone with more appropriate credentials. Probably, Yara agreed. I intend to request your continuity, Cora said. I will request it formally, through the hegemony's official channel to your joint command. I will note that the communication structure established during this crisis was effective and that replacing it introduces risk during a period of continued uncertainty. Yara was quiet for a moment. They may not honor that request, she said. No, the consul agreed. But they will have to decline it explicitly, which means explaining to their council why they're declining it. Which is a different conversation than simply reassigning you without justification. It was, Yara reflected, a precise piece of institutional maneuvering. Cora had been studying human institutions for 11 years. She had learned how to use their own processes as tools. You've been planning this, Yara said. Not the engagement, the aftermath. I have been thinking about it, the consul said. Since you first walked through the pressurization gate and attempted the acknowledgement gesture. My angle was off, Yara said. Your angle was slightly off, Cora agreed. But you had practiced it. That is what I noticed. Yara leaned back in her chair. Outside the platform's hull, somewhere in the distance that sensors measured in light minutes, the Surathi fleet was receding. In Geneva, the Security Council was beginning the session that would run for 16 hours. Admiral Park was writing an after-action report. Mwangi was answering calls from officials who had not been involved and now wanted to appear to have been involved. The maintenance crew on the L3 platform had finished their hull inspection, and someone had made a note in the work log about a seal in Section 9 that needed replacing. The engagement had held. The defense had held, not perfectly, not without cost, but held. 14 people were dead. More were injured. 2 carrier groups were damaged. 1 destroyer was gone. It was not a victory in the triumphant sense. It was something more durable than that. It was a demonstration of function. Of systems, military, diplomatic, intelligence, operating under pressure without collapsing. Of decisions made by individuals that the institutions those individuals worked for had not quite authorized and did not quite sanction but had, in the event, relied upon entirely. I want to ask you something, Yara said. Yes, the consul said. When you first looked at me, on the platform, in that first moment, and you said that civilians perform and soldiers observe. What were you actually observing? In me? Consul Cora was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Yara wondered if the translation was struggling. Then the consul said, someone who was uncomfortable with being sent as an insult but who had decided to do the job anyway. Yara thought about that. That sounds about right, she said. Yes, the consul said. That is why I accepted you with honor. The relay console hummed quietly. Somewhere in the data stream, the Surathi fleet's withdrawal vector continued its steady track away from human space. The hegemony's monitoring systems continued their patient observation of a region that had been, until recently, stable in its instabilities. It was not over. It would not be over for years. The diplomatic work, the military repositioning, the Surathi response, the hegemony's internal debate, the question of what humanity and the Kethvaran would build from the foundation of a crisis they had navigated together without ever formally agreeing to do so. But the line had held. Not because it was perfect, because the people standing on it had decided it was worth standing on. That, in the end, was the only kind of line that ever held.